Every time the world faces an economic collapse, humanity reaches for the same solution. We print money. We call it a stimulus, a bailout, a rescue plan. We tell ourselves that numbers on a screen can keep factories running, paychecks flowing, and markets calm. And, for a while, it works. Prices stabilize. Banks reopen. Politicians declare victory. The public breathes again. But beneath the relief, something quieter begins to stir. A question that no one wants to ask out loud. What if the rescue isn't a cure, but a postponement? Money has always been our greatest illusion, a mirror reflecting both our power and our fear. When confidence collapses, governments step in to manufacture faith, not just currency. Printing money feels like control. It feels like progress. Yet every note that comes into existence, without real creation behind it, carries an invisible debt, a promise to the future that someone, someday, will have to repay. History doesn't repeat word for word, but it rhymes with unnerving precision. Ancient empires, modern nations, digital economies, all have tried to conjure prosperity by decree. Each time it begins with good intentions. To save jobs, to preserve order, to buy time, and each time it ends with the same realization that time cannot be bought, only borrowed. This is a story about that cycle, about how societies, terrified of collapse, invent new ways to delay it, how printing money to save the economy has become the ritual of our age, a modern faith that believes in salvation through expansion. But if history is a teacher, it's also a warning. The longer we delay the reckoning, the heavier it becomes. Because when a system avoids pain, it doesn't escape it. It transfers it forward in time, outward to others, hidden behind statistics and slogans. The truth is uncomfortable but simple. Money printing doesn't eliminate crisis. It disguises it, stretches it, rebrands it, until the illusion finally breaks. And when that illusion does break, what remains is not just an economic failure, but a moral one. A civilization that mistook the creation of currency for the creation of value. Before money became paper, and long before it became pixels on a screen, it was something far more fragile: belief. Every coin, every note, every digital balance in your account represents a shared act of trust. Trust that the piece of paper you hand over will be accepted by someone else tomorrow. Trust that the institution behind it, whether a king, an empire, or a central bank, will still stand when you need it. Money began not as wealth itself, but as a promise of value. It was a symbol, a language that allowed strangers to cooperate across distance and time. But like all symbols, it only works as long as everyone agrees on what it means. In the 11th century, during China's Song Dynasty, this idea was taken further than ever before. Metal coins were heavy, trade was booming, and merchants needed something lighter, faster, more convenient. The government introduced paper money, jiaozi, the world's first national currency not backed by metal. It was revolutionary. At first, the system worked beautifully. The paper could be redeemed for silver or gold. The economy expanded. Commerce flourished. The emperor had discovered a new kind of power, the ability to create money with a brushstroke. But soon, temptation followed. Wars needed funding. Palaces needed building. Officials needed paying. Printing paper was easier than raising taxes or cutting spending, and slowly, the promise behind the paper that it could always be exchanged for real metal began to weaken. When the state printed beyond its reserves, trust fractured, prices surged, merchants demanded silver again. People began to lose faith in the paper that once symbolized prosperity. What started as a brilliant innovation became the seed of collapse. The Song experiment revealed a timeless truth. You can print money, but you cannot print trust. Once belief breaks, no decree can restore it. That lesson echoed through centuries, across empires and kingdoms, through revolutions and resets. Money at its core is not a thing we own. It is a story we tell, about value, about order, about the future. But when that story becomes fiction, when leaders believe they can create wealth by command, the stage is set for history's most familiar tragedy. The promise outgrows the reality behind it. The Roman Empire didn't invent inflation, but it perfected the art of denial. At its height, Rome was the most powerful civilization on earth, a machine of conquest, order, and spectacle. Its currency, the silver denarius, was more than a coin. It was a declaration. Rome endures. Soldiers were paid in it, merchants trusted it, and citizens saw in it the reflection of imperial strength. But strength is expensive. The empire's borders stretched across continents. Legions had to be fed, roads built, wars financed, emperors glorified. And as the treasury strained under the weight of empire, Rome discovered a shortcut that felt ingenious, almost magical. They didn't have to mint more silver. They could simply use less of it. Under Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. A coin that once held nearly pure silver was now a mix. Silver on the outside, base metal within. It glittered the same in the sunlight, but its substance was diluted. The people accepted it. After all, it still bore the emperor's face. Over the next centuries, this small deception became routine. Each new emperor faced the same dilemma: spend more, promise more, and somehow keep the illusion alive. The denarius grew lighter, thinner, emptier. By the time of the 3rd century, it contained less than 5% silver, a coin in name only. Inflation soared. Prices for basic goods multiplied. Soldiers demanded higher pay. The empire responded by minting more coins, which only accelerated the spiral. Trust, that invisible foundation of money, eroded into dust. Rome's citizens began hoarding real metal, rejecting imperial currency. Trade faltered. The army, once loyal to the empire, turned mercenary, and with every debased coin, the promise of Rome, eternal, divine, unbreakable, slipped closer to myth. What fell wasn't just a monetary system, it was faith in the empire itself. When the money failed, the story failed. And yet, centuries later, we would make the same mistake, not with silver, but with paper, and eventually with digits. Because the Roman lesson is one we seem programmed to forget. Every empire believes it can cheat reality a little longer, stretch faith a little further, and print just enough to postpone decline. But as Rome proved, even the mightiest power cannot mint immortality. Centuries after Rome's fall, the world rediscovered its own version of alchemy. But this time, the forge wasn't in the emperor's palace. It was in the quiet marble halls of central banks. By the early 20th century, the industrial world had learned how to give money creation a new, respectable face. It was no longer called debasement or manipulation. It was called monetary policy. The language changed, the power remained. In 1913, the United States created the Federal Reserve, a lender of last resort, designed to prevent financial panic. Its mission sounded noble: to stabilize the economy, to ensure liquidity, to keep the machine running smoothly. Yet behind that promise lay the same ancient temptation, the ability to create money at will, detached from tangible limits. For a time, there was still one constraint: gold. The gold standard was the anchor that tethered currency to something real, something scarce. A dollar was a claim on gold, not an abstraction. Governments could not print without consequence. Every note carried a whisper of discipline. But discipline is inconvenient. Wars, recessions, and politics demand flexibility, not restraint. During the world wars, nations printed vast sums to finance destruction. Afterward, the debts lingered, and leaders realized that gold was a chain they no longer wanted around their wrists. The breaking point came in 1971. President Richard Nixon, facing inflation and a drained gold reserve, announced that the United States would no longer redeem dollars for gold. It was a quiet revolution disguised as a technical adjustment. But in truth, it was the moment money became pure faith. From that day on, the dollar was backed not by metal, but by confidence. Confidence in the government, in the central bank, in the story that this paper, this number, still meant something. And for decades, that story held. Economies expanded, markets soared, and most people never questioned the foundation beneath their prosperity. But like the Roman denarius, the modern system depended on belief. And belief can only stretch so far before it starts to tremble. The creation of central banks turned money printing into a science. Economists replaced emperors' models, replaced decrees. but the essence was unchanged. When crisis looms, create more money, promise stability, and pray the system absorbs it. We had transformed the act of printing money from a sign of desperation into a ritual of confidence. The printing press was no longer seen as the symptom of collapse. It had become the cure itself. But every cure carries a side effect, and every faith machine must eventually face the limits of belief. When the system trembled in 2008, the world looked once again to its modern priests, the central bankers. The crisis began as a slow crack in the foundation of housing, but beneath that crack was something deeper. A financial world addicted to leverage, speculation, and the illusion of endless growth. Banks failed, credit froze, panic spread. The global economy stood on the edge of collapse, and governments reached for the only tool they still trusted. The printing press, now digital, silent, and infinite. They called it quantitative easing. It sounded technical, almost harmless. The Federal Reserve began buying bonds, injecting trillions into the system. Europe followed. Japan had been doing it for decades. The idea was simple. Flood the world with money, lower interest rates, and force the economy to start breathing again. It worked, at least on the surface. Markets recovered. Banks were saved. The headlines turned hopeful, but what looked like healing was in truth a massive transfusion. The patient lived, but the disease of debt had only gone deeper into the bloodstream. Quantitative easing didn't erase bad investments or reckless speculation. It simply covered them in liquidity. It rewarded those who owned assets and quietly punished those who didn't. Stocks soared, but wages stagnated. Wealth concentrated. The system became more unequal, more fragile, and more dependent on constant intervention. And then in 2020, the world faced something far bigger than a financial crash. A full stop. The pandemic froze movement, trade, and work itself. Overnight, governments did what once seemed unthinkable. They printed at a scale history had never witnessed. Stimulus checks, emergency loans, relief packages. Money conjured from nothing, justified by crisis. For months, it felt miraculous. Businesses survived. People stayed afloat. Consumption roared back. Central banks assured the public that inflation would remain under control. But the laws of economics, like gravity, cannot be suspended forever. Prices began to rise. Supply chains snapped. Trillions of new dollars, euros, and yen flowed through economies that had been half asleep for years. The illusion of stability began to warp. In every era, printing money feels like power. It feels like action in the face of chaos. Yet beneath the surface, it is always the same trade, exchanging tomorrow's certainty for today's comfort. The 2008 bailout, the pandemic stimulus, the endless rounds of easing, all part of one long continuous act of postponement. The debt never disappeared, it was merely buried under new layers of credit and confidence. And in that process, something subtle but profound began to shift. The public stopped believing that economies could recover without intervention. Printing became not an emergency tool, but the default solution, the oxygen that kept the system alive. It was no longer a last resort. It was the only resort. And as history has always warned, the moment a society forgets the difference between saving itself and sedating itself, the countdown to the next crisis quietly begins. Inflation doesn't arrive with the drama of a crash or the panic of a run on banks. It moves quietly, almost politely, like water seeping into the walls of a house. You don't notice it at first. Then one day you realize everything costs more, and somehow your money feels smaller. Governments call it a sign of a recovering economy. Economists debate whether it's transitory or structural. But for ordinary people, it's something far simpler. The slow evaporation of trust. Trust that wages will keep up with prices. Trust that savings mean something. Trust that effort still translates into progress. Inflation eats these beliefs from the inside, replacing them with suspicion and fatigue. We've seen this movie before. In the 1920s, Germany's Weimar Republic printed money to pay its debts after World War I. At first, the strategy looked clever. It allowed the state to meet its obligations without overtly defaulting. But as the presses rolled, the currency began to unravel. By 1923, a loaf of bread cost billions of marks. People carried cash in wheelbarrows, and faith in money itself collapsed. In Zimbabwe decades later, the same pattern repeated. So many zeros filled the bills that people joked about using them as notepaper. Argentina has lived through wave after wave of devaluation, each new currency promising a reset, each one ending in the same erosion of confidence. But hyperinflation is only the loudest symptom. Most societies decay more quietly. 2% inflation becomes 3, then 5. Budgets tighten, small luxuries vanish. People stop saving because saving feels pointless. They buy now, afraid prices will rise tomorrow. And in doing so, they make inflation worse. It is a cycle of psychology as much as economics. When trust fades, behavior changes. And when behavior changes, the system accelerates its own decline. John Maynard Keynes once warned that inflation is not merely an economic phenomenon, but a political one. By continuing a process of inflation, he wrote, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. Inflation is taxation without legislation. It transfers value from those who earn and save to those who borrow and spend. It rewards debt and punishes discipline. And it tells a story, a quiet confession that a nation prefers slow decay to sudden reckoning. The erosion of trust is almost invisible until it's complete. One day, people stop believing the numbers. They stop believing the promises. And when money itself becomes a question mark, what remains to hold a society together? For most of history, inflation has been a mirror, reflecting not just economic imbalance, but moral fatigue, a sign that we've chosen comfort over consequence and illusion over truth. Because trust, once lost, is never simply restored. It must be rebuilt, not with policy, but with honesty. If history keeps repeating the same mistakes, it's not because we fail to learn. It's because we refuse to face pain. Every policymaker, every central banker, every citizen knows that printing money cannot solve structural problems. It cannot make debt disappear or productivity rise. But when crisis comes, when markets tremble and jobs vanish, the alternative, doing nothing, feels unthinkable. So we choose the illusion, we choose to delay. There's a peculiar comfort in believing that complexity can be conquered with liquidity, that fear can be drowned in stimulus, that we can outsmart the consequences of our own excess. Printing money becomes the psychological equivalent of hitting snooze on an alarm we no longer wish to hear. The human mind is wired for short-term survival. Faced with uncertainty, we seek immediate relief. Leaders are no different. Their timelines are political. Their incentives are short. A crisis solved today, even imperfectly, is a victory, while a collapse postponed until tomorrow is someone else's problem. And so, governments inflate their way out of difficulty. Citizens adapt. Markets cheer. The numbers go up, the mood improves, and the illusion feels real again. But deep down, everyone senses the trade. The future is being quietly sold to pay for the present. Behavioral economists call this time inconsistency, our tendency to favor immediate gratification over long-term benefit. It explains diets abandoned, budgets broken, and also entire monetary systems that collapse under their own indulgence. Each time we print, we promise ourselves it's temporary. Each time we swear, we'll reverse it when things stabilize. But temporary policies have a way of becoming permanent, especially when the public grows addicted to their effects. The result is a world that confuses healing with sedation. Stimulus replaces strategy. Debt replaces discipline. Inflation becomes not a warning, but a way of life. And underneath it all is fear. Fear of admitting that perhaps the system itself is unsustainable, that the growth we worship might not be eternal, that our safety nets are woven from promises we can no longer afford. So we keep pressing the button. We keep printing, refinancing, stimulating, not because we believe it will save us forever, but because it saves us now. In that sense, money printing isn't an economic decision. It's an existential one. It reveals our deepest instinct to postpone reckoning, to avoid collapse, to buy one more day of calm. But the longer we live in that comfort, the more fragile it becomes, because a world that depends on constant rescue eventually forgets how to stand on its own. And when faith in the rescue fades, there's nothing left to fall back on but the truth we've tried so hard to delay. Every postponement carries a cost, and every delay writes a debt into the future. For a while, the system absorbs it. Growth resumes, confidence returns, and the cycle continues. But eventually, the bill comes due, not in one dramatic collapse, but through a quiet, relentless reckoning. Imagine an economy as a patient in intensive care. Each crisis weakens it. Each intervention, each rate, cut, bailout, or round of quantitative easing is another dose of morphine. The pain subsides, but the disease remains. And over time, the body forgets how to heal on its own. That is where the modern world finds itself today, sustained by stimulus, addicted to low interest rates, unable to function without intervention. Every market correction, every slowdown, is met with the same reflex: more liquidity, more debt, more delay. The cure has become the condition. At some point, the future we borrowed from stops cooperating. Growth stagnates under the weight of accumulated promises. Productivity falls. Inequality widens. And trust in institutions thins to transparency. People start asking questions that used to be unthinkable. What gives money its value if it can be created infinitely? Who really benefits from this system? What happens when confidence itself inflates beyond repair? Economists call it debt saturation, a stage where creating more money produces diminishing returns. Each printed dollar adds less to real growth and more to distortion. It's like trying to quench thirst with salt water. The more you drink, the worse it gets. And as this saturation deepens, money begins to lose its meaning. It stops being a measure of value and becomes a tool of survival, a temporary token in a game where the rules keep changing. People stop saving and start speculating. Companies stop innovating and start leveraging. The economy becomes less about creation and more about preservation. When that moment arrives, when faith in the future is no longer strong enough to sustain the illusion, no decree, no policy, no printing press can restore it. Because what collapses isn't just currency, it's belief itself. The irony is almost poetic. The very act of trying to control uncertainty breeds the conditions that make uncertainty inevitable. Every rescue sows the seeds of the next emergency. Every postponement sharpens the reckoning that will one day arrive. And when it does, it rarely looks like panic at first. It begins as fatigue, a subtle loss of energy, optimism, and coherence. Markets stumble. Politics polarize. The center no longer holds. People stop believing that tomorrow will be better than today. That's how the future arrives, not with a crash, but with a sigh. History never truly repeats, but it has a rhythm, one that hums beneath every chart, every currency, every empire that believed itself eternal. The rhythm of creation, expansion, overreach, and collapse. The rhythm of faith and forgetting, from the Song emperors of China to the Roman Caesars. From the printing mania of the 18th century to the monetary revolutions of the 20th, the pattern endures. Each age invents a new vocabulary to hide an old truth. When we print to save ourselves, we are not erasing the crisis, we are postponing it. The cost of postponement is subtle at first. Prices creep up, trust decays. Inequality widens, then one day the curtain falls. And what we called stability is revealed for what it was: an elaborate pause before the inevitable. Our age is no different. We call it modern monetary theory, quantitative easing, fiscal stimulus. But the essence remains unchanged. We are borrowing from the future, monetizing belief, and treating the symptoms of a system that no longer knows how to rest without breaking. The lesson repeated across millennia is that no society can outrun its own contradictions. Money, once detached from reality, always finds its way back to it, often violently. And yet the point of history isn't despair. It's recognition. To see that we are not condemned to repeat the same mistakes, only inclined to. That understanding the rhythm gives us a chance, however slim, to break it. What if instead of printing to preserve the old order, we allowed renewal to happen? What if we faced the pain we've been deferring and built systems that don't rely on perpetual inflation, endless debt, or blind faith in intervention? That would require courage, the rarest currency of all. Because the real danger of printing money is not the inflation it causes, but the illusion it sustains. The illusion that we can live beyond consequence. Every rescue carries a hidden cost, and every delay deepens it. The world is not collapsing because we print. It's collapsing because we've forgotten what money truly is. A reflection of trust, of discipline, of shared purpose. When those vanish, paper and pixels are all that remain. So perhaps the real question isn't how much can we print, but how long can we pretend? Because history always comes to collect. It may forgive, it may delay, but it never forgets. And when the reckoning arrives, it won't ask how much we created, only what we created it for. If you found value in this journey, leave a like and subscribe to True Financial Stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.